The first thing Nora Bell found was not a wagon. It was a blue china cup hanging from a dead pine branch nearly 9,000 feet above the Colorado Valley. The handle had been tied to the branch with a strip of leather. Snow had bleached the leather pale, but the knot still held. 20 years earlier, 18 settlers had ridden into these mountains. Not one had returned. Nora sat on her mare beneath the tree and stared at the cup while cold wind pushed loose hair against her cheek. Someone had placed it there. Someone had expected to come back for it. That was what made her climb down from the saddle. 3 weeks earlier, Nora had been sleeping behind the kitchen of a boarding house in Elk Crossing. At 26, she owned 1 horse, 2 dresses, a wool coat, and a brass compass that had belonged to her mother. The boarding house owner paid her for washing sheets, carrying coal, and peeling potatoes until her fingers stayed cracked around the nails. Nora had once lived on a small cattle place outside town. Then a spring flood took the lower pasture. Debt took the rest. By September, another family was eating supper at the table where Nora had grown up. She stopped walking past the property after that. At the boarding house, freight drivers talked while she worked. Most of their stories were louder after whiskey. Nora learned which stories grew larger with every telling. She also learned which ones made grown men lower their voices. The missing settlers belonged to the second kind. They had left Fort Garland in May of 1869. 3 families, 18 people, 5 wagons. They were headed west toward good grazing land beyond the mountain range. A late storm closed the main pass, so they turned onto an older mining road through Black Elk Ridge. A hunter saw them enter the timber. No one saw them come out. Search parties went up that summer. They found a broken wheel rim near a creek. Nothing more. By winter, the story hardened into a simple answer. The mountain had taken them. Keep one detail in mind. Nobody had ever found the wagons. Nora heard that part from an old mule driver named Frank Mercer. He had one cloudy eye and hands bent from 40 years of rains. He watched Nora drying plates near the kitchen stove. "They searched the wrong drainage," he said. One of the other drivers laughed. Frank did not. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his coat and drew a crooked ridge with one finger. The old road split above Crow Creek. Maps showed one trail. There were 2. Nora stopped drawing the plate. Where did the second one go? Frank looked toward the dining room before answering. High country. Why didn't the search parties take it? Because a rock slide covered the turn. He drank his coffee. By the time anybody remembered the old cut, 10 years had passed. Nora looked down at the rough map. Frank folded it again. You thinking about something foolish? No, he gave her the paper anyway. 5 mornings later, Nora rode north before sunrise. She told the boarding house owner she was looking for fall work at a sheep camp. That explanation survived until she reached the last ranch above Crow Creek. Beyond it, there were no fences, only timber. The old trail rose through pine and aspen. Some stretches were wide enough for wagons. Others had nearly vanished beneath roots and fallen stone. Nora moved slowly. Her mare, Millie, was 13 years old and knew better than to waste strength climbing. When Millie stopped, Nora stopped. When the mare lowered her nose toward uncertain ground, Nora climbed down and walked. By the second afternoon, the valley behind them had disappeared. The temperature dropped hard after sunset. Nora slept beneath a spruce with her coat buttoned to her throat and one hand inside the blanket around the compass. Sometime after midnight, stones moved on the slope above her. Millie lifted her head. Nora sat upright. Another stone clicked against rock. Then nothing. She stayed awake until the eastern sky turned gray. Near noon, she found the first wagon rut. It was shallow. Almost gone. 2 lines crossed a patch of hard ground between the trees. They were too evenly spaced to be animal tracks. Nora crouched beside them and brushed pine needles away. The earth beneath was packed firm. She followed the marks uphill. An hour later, she found a rusted square nail. Then, a strip of iron. Then the blue cup hanging from the dead pine. Nora untied it carefully. There was a small crack near the rim. Inside, protected by the cup's curve, someone had scratched 3 letters into the glaze. M-R-B. Nora rubbed her thumb across them. She knew those letters. Everyone in Elk Crossing knew them. They belonged to Matthew Reed Bell, her mother's older brother. A man Nora had been told died before she was born. A man whose name appeared on the list of 18 missing settlers. The wind stopped for several seconds. Nora looked uphill. Beyond the dead pine, the old road disappeared between 2 walls of black timber. Millie raised her head sharply. Her ears pointed toward the trees. Nora heard wood move. Not a branch, not a trunk. A long, low wooden groan. She tied the cup to her saddle and started upward. The road bent around a granite shoulder. The trees opened. Nora stopped so suddenly that Millie walked into her back. Below them lay a hidden basin filled with yellow autumn grass, and along its far edge stood 5 covered wagons. Their wheels had sunk deep into the ground. Canvas hung in torn gray sheets. A kettle still dangled beneath one wagon. A small chair rested upside down on another. 20 years of weather had passed over them, but the wagons were still there. Nora took 3 steps into the basin. Then she saw something beside the nearest wheel. The grass had been pressed flat. Not 20 years ago. Recently, and in the soft dirt beside it, was the clear print of a human boot. Nora did not call out. She crouched beside the boot print and pressed 2 fingers into the edge. The soil was still damp. The mark had not been there long. Millie shifted behind her and blew hard through her nose. Nora stood and scanned the basin. 5 wagons. A dead fire ring. Tall grass moving under the wind. No person. No horse. No smoke. Yet someone had walked beside that wagon. Nora pulled the small revolver from her saddlebag and checked the cylinder. Her father had taught her to shoot cans from fence posts when she was 14. He had also taught her something more useful. A gun was not an answer. It was what a person carried when there might be no time left to look for one. She slipped it into her coat pocket. The first wagon leaned toward one broken wheel. Its canvas had split down the middle, leaving the inside exposed to years of snow. Nora climbed onto the tailgate. A cracked flour barrel stood against one wall. There were 2 tin plates. A child's coat had been folded beneath a wooden box. Nora touched the cloth. It broke beneath her fingers. She pulled her hand away. On the floor near the driver's seat lay a leather-bound book swollen from damp. Most of the pages had fused together. Nora opened what she could. A name appeared near the front. Samuel Grady. She knew it from the old newspaper list. He had traveled with his wife and 3 children. Nora turned another page. A few words remained readable. June 2. Snow hire. Anna coughing. Reed says trail ahead may still open. Nora stopped. Reed, Matthew Reed Bell. Her uncle. She turned the page carefully. Half of it tore away. The next entry was darker. June 4. No passage west. Animals weakening. Matthew found water below Southern Ridge. We move at first light. Nora read it twice. The settlers had not vanished in the basin. They had left it. She climbed down and looked toward the Southern Ridge. That was when she noticed the missing wagon tongues. 3 of the wagons still had them. 2 did not. They had been cut away cleanly. Someone had needed long pieces of strong wood. For what? Nora walked to the second wagon. A woman's comb lay beside a cracked mirror. A sewing basket had spilled across the floor. Inside the basket, rusted needles still rested in a small cushion. Near the rear wall was a narrow wooden cradle. Nora stood beside it without touching it. A leather shoe rested inside. It could have fit in her palm. Wind passed through the torn canvas. The cradle moved once, then stopped. Nora stepped back outside. The boot print remained in her mind. Fresh, sharp, alone, she followed the edge of the basin. Near the fourth wagon, she found another print. Then, another. They led toward the timber. Someone had crossed the meadow that morning, perhaps only hours before her. Nora tied Millie to a small fir and followed on foot. The ground dropped behind the trees. A narrow path descended between rocks, hidden from the wagon basin, unless a person already knew where to look. Broken branches marked the first 100 yards. Nora touched one. The wood beneath the bark was pale. Fresh, she continued. The path became steeper. At one point she found an iron hook driven into a tree trunk. The metal was old, but the rope tied through it was not. The hemp was dry. New. Nora's breathing shortened. Someone had been using this trail. She followed it another quarter-mile. The trees ended at a narrow ravine. Below, water ran through dark rock. On the far side stood a small cabin. It had been built against the cliff beneath an overhang. The roof was patched with wagon canvas. Smoke rose from a stone pipe. Nora stopped behind a pine. A man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with gray hair falling over his collar. A rifle hung in one hand. He walked to a pile of split wood and set the rifle against the cabin wall. Then, he turned toward the creek. Nora saw his face. There was a long white scar running from his left temple to his jaw. He filled a bucket. Before he turned back, Nora stepped from behind the tree. "Sir." The bucket fell. Water struck the stones. The man spun toward the rifle. Nora raised both hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." He stopped. His eyes stayed on her. "How did you find this place?" "I followed the wagons." His jaw tightened. "You should go back." "I can't." "You can." "My uncle was with them." That changed something. The man did not move toward the rifle. Nora reached slowly into her coat and took out the blue cup. She held it by the handle. "MRB." The man stared at it. His face lost what little color the cold had left. "Where did you get that?" "Hanging from a tree above the basin." He looked toward the ridge. His mouth opened, but no words came. Nora took one step closer. "Matthew Bell was my mother's brother." The man lowered his eyes. For several seconds, only creek water moved between them. Then he said, "Your mother's name was Sarah." Nora stopped. No one outside her family had used that name in years. "How do you know that?" The man looked up. "Because Matthew talked about her every night." Nora stared at him. "You knew my uncle." The man reached for the cabin wall and rested one hand against it. "I knew all 18. Nora's fingers closed tighter around the cup. "Then tell me what happened." He shook his head. "You came 20 years too late for a simple answer." Nora looked past him. Something hung beside the cabin door. A small wooden board. Names had been carved into it. She could see Samuel Grady, Anna Grady, 3 more. Then Matthew Bell. But there were not 18 names. There were 17. Nora counted again. The man followed her eyes. "You noticed, one name is missing." "Yes, whose?" He looked toward the dark opening of the cabin, then back at Nora. "Mine." Nora looked at the 17 carved names, then at the man standing beside the cabin. "You were number 18. He nodded. "My name is Caleb Ward." The name meant nothing to her. Caleb seemed to understand that. It should not. He picked up the bucket he had dropped and set it upright beside the creek. For a few seconds he watched the water run around the stones. Then he lifted his rifle from the wall. "Come inside before the weather turns." Nora looked toward the ridge. Clouds had gathered above the basin. The light was already flattening against the trees. She followed him. The cabin was smaller than it looked from outside. One bunk, one table, a stove made from an iron drum, bundles of dried plants hung from rafters blackened by years of smoke. Against the far wall stood 2 wooden trunks. Caleb placed the rifle beside the door. Nora remained standing. 17 names. Yes, you said you knew all 18. I did. Then why are 17 dead? Caleb sat slowly at the table. His left hand shook when he rested it on the wood. Not much. Just enough for Nora to notice. They didn't die together. That answer made the room seem smaller. Nora sat opposite him. Caleb looked at the blue cup still in her hand. Matthew carried that from Missouri. How do you know? His sister painted the flowers. Nora turned the cup. 3 faded blue flowers curved beneath the handle. Her mother had painted flowers on plates when Nora was a child. The same simple petals. Nora placed the cup between them. Start at the Wagons. Caleb rubbed one thumb across a scar in the table. The snow came early. So the journal said. You found Samuel's book. Yes, then you know we could not cross west. Caleb leaned back. The animals were running out of feed. 2 children were coughing. 1 woman could barely stand. Matthew found a game trail heading south. He believed it would reach lower country. He left to get help? Caleb nodded. He wanted to take me. Why didn't you go? Samuel needed someone who knew horses. Caleb looked toward the window. Matthew rode out alone. Nora waited. He never came back. He came down. Caleb's eyes moved to her. My mother told me he reached El Crossing months later. Caleb went still. How? I don't know. The old man lowered his head. Then he survived more than I thought. Nora leaned forward. What happened after he left? Caleb drew a breath through his nose. 3 days later, Samuel decided we could not wait. They left the wagons with blankets, dried meat, tools, and 2 pack animals. The children who could walk were tied together with rope so none could slip away in the trees. Caleb led the first horse. Samuel took the rear. The plan was simple. Follow the game trail down, find Matthew, find help. Return for the wagons when the snow cleared. They made 4 miles the first day. Then the mountain changed the plan. A section of the trail had broken away above a gorge. The party spent most of the next morning cutting around it. By afternoon, one of the pack animals slipped. It pulled a crate, 2 blankets, and most of their flour down the ravine. They could hear the animal below. They could not reach it. Caleb stopped speaking. Nora saw his fingers tighten around the table edge. What happened next? The cold came. He looked toward the stove. Not snow. Cold, the temperature dropped hard enough that water froze inside cups before dawn. They moved lower. One child became too weak to walk. Then another. Samuel wanted to turn back. But the climb to the wagons had become worse than the way ahead, so they kept descending. Nora's eyes stayed on him. How many reached the bottom? Caleb did not answer. Instead, he stood. He crossed to one of the wooden trunks and opened it. Inside were folded coats, a woman's shawl, 2 children's caps, a Bible, a leather pouch. Caleb lifted the pouch and set it on the table. These belonged to them. Nora did not touch it. How many? 7. The number landed between them. Nora stared at him. 7 people came out? 7 reached this ravine. She looked around the cabin. This ravine? Caleb nodded. There was no cabin then. The survivors sheltered beneath the rock ledge behind it. Samuel Grady was among them. So was his wife, one of their children. 2 brothers from the second family. Caleb and a 12-year-old girl named Lydia Crane. 11 others had been buried along the descent, some beneath stones, some beneath snow. 2 could not be buried at all because the ground had frozen too hard. Nora pressed her palms flat against her knees. What happened to the 7? Caleb looked at the carved board outside. Samuel died that winter. Here? Yes, his wife? Spring, the others? One by one. Caleb spoke without decoration. An infected cut, a fall through creek ice, a winter cough that never left. One brother tried to reach the valley alone and did not return. Lydia Crane lived the longest. She stayed with me 12 years. Nora noticed a second cup beside the stove, smaller than Caleb's. Clean, placed upside down on a folded cloth. When did she die? 8 winters ago. The old man's eyes remained on the cup. Nora turned toward the door. Why didn't you leave? Caleb gave a short, dry breath. We tried. We? Lydia and I. They had gone down twice. The first time, spring runoff blocked the lower gorge. The second time, Caleb broke his ankle and nearly lost the foot. After that, years began stacking on top of years. They grew food in a clearing lower down, trapped rabbits, gathered roots, stored snow. The outside world became a place measured by distant gunshots and smoke seen from the ridge. But you have new rope, Nora said. Caleb looked at her. And the boot prints are fresh. For the first time since she entered the cabin, his face tightened. Nora stood. Someone else has been here. Caleb said nothing. Who? He looked toward the window. The clouds outside had dropped lower. Nora, you need to leave before dark. She stepped closer to the table. Who made those tracks? Caleb moved toward the rifle, not quickly, but deliberately. Nora's hand went to her coat pocket. Then a sound came from outside. 3 knocks, wood against wood. Caleb stopped. The skin around his eyes tightened. Another knock came, then another. Slow, evenly spaced. Nora looked toward the door. Who is that? Caleb whispered the answer. The reason I never came back to town. The latch began to lift. The latch lifted another inch. Caleb reached the door first. He did not take the rifle. That told Nora more than the rifle would have. He opened the door. A man stood beneath the overhang with rain shining on his shoulders. He was perhaps 50. Broad through the chest, gray beginning in his beard. A pack hung from one shoulder, and in his right hand he carried a narrow walking staff. He looked at Caleb, then at Nora. You brought somebody here. I did not bring her. The man stepped inside and shut the door against the wind. His eyes stayed on Nora. What did she see? The wagons. The man's jaw shifted. What else? Nora answered for herself. The names. Silence filled the little cabin. The stranger lowered his pack. Then she needs to leave. Nora pulled the blue cup from her coat. I came because of Matthew Bell. The man looked at the initials. His face changed. Not much. His fingers simply stopped moving on the strap of his pack. Where did you get that? Above the wagon basin. Caleb spoke quietly. She is Sarah Bell's daughter. The stranger closed his eyes. Only for a second. When he opened them, he looked older. My name is Thomas Reed. Nora waited. Thomas walked to the table and sat opposite her. I was 13 when the train disappeared. You weren't with them. No, he looked at Caleb. My father was. Nora glanced toward the board outside. Which name? Amos Reed. One of the 17. Thomas had spent most of his life hearing that his father had abandoned his family. That was the story Elk Crossing had accepted. A man disappeared with a wagon train. No body came home. No letter came back. So people filled the empty place with whatever answer was easiest to live beside. 20 years later, Thomas had found the old cutoff. He had found Caleb, and Caleb had shown him where Amos Reed lay beneath a cairn of mountain stone 2 miles below the ravine. Thomas had been returning every autumn since. He brought rope, salt, coffee, lamp oil, sometimes boots, sometimes nothing but company. Nora looked toward the fresh tracks she had followed from the basin. Those were yours. Thomas nodded. I checked the wagons before winter. Why keep them hidden? He looked at Caleb. Caleb answered. Because men came once. Nora waited. Prospectors, Caleb said. 12 years ago. They found the lower trail. Lydia and I watched them strip brass from one wagon before we drove them off. Thomas leaned forward. If word reached town that 5 wagons were sitting intact in a mountain basin, people would climb up here with saws, ropes, souvenir boxes, and stories to sell. Nora looked down at the cup in her hands. They belong to families. They belong to the dead, Thomas said. And to the living. Nobody answered that. Rain tapped against the roof. Nora reached into her saddlebag and pulled out Samuel Grady's damaged journal. She set it on the table. This says, Matthew went for help. Caleb nodded. Thomas looked at him. You never knew what happened after? Not until today. Nora told them what little she knew. Matthew had reached Elk Crossing months later. He arrived thin enough that people remembered his cheekbones. He stayed only several weeks. He never returned to the mountain. He built a life. Then buried most of the road behind his silence. Thomas rubbed one hand over his beard. He must have thought everyone died. Caleb looked toward the stove. He thought wrong. Maybe. Nora turned to him. Caleb's hand rested beside Lydia's small cup. He also came back to a meadow with no people and no tracks he could follow through fresh snow. A man can spend 40 years punishing himself for what weather did in one afternoon. Nora said nothing. She had heard her mother once describe Matthew Bell as a man who woke before dawn even when there was nowhere to go. Now she understood why. By morning, the storm had passed. Snow covered the ridge above the cabin, not deep, enough to whiten every branch and hide the trail in places. Thomas packed for the basin. Nora followed. Caleb did not. His knees no longer trusted the climb. Before Nora left, he handed her a small leather pouch. Inside was a tin whistle. The metal had gone dull. Matthew gave that to Lydia on the 3rd night after the snow came. Nora turned it in her palm. Why? She was crying. Caleb looked toward the window. He told her she could blow it if she got separated. Did she? Once, his mouth moved at one corner, nearly scared every horse off the mountain. Nora slipped the whistle into her pocket. Thomas and Nora climbed in cold sunlight. The basin appeared below them by noon. 5 wagons, white grass, black timber. Nothing moved. Nora walked directly to the 2nd wagon. Inside, she searched beneath the bench, along the sideboard, beneath the rotted bedroll. Near the floor she found a narrow strip of wood, held by 2 handmade screws. She removed them with the blade of her knife. Behind the panel was a folded paper, wrapped in waxed cloth. Thomas watched from the tailgate. Nora opened it. The writing had faded, but the name at the top remained clear. Sarah, her mother. Matthew had written the letter before riding out for help. If he failed to return, he wanted whoever found the wagons to send it east. The letter was short. He told Sarah he was going down for medicine. He told her not to believe any man who said courage meant standing still when people needed something done. At the bottom, one line had been added sideways in the margin. Tell Mother I kept the blue cup. Nora stopped reading. Her thumb pressed against the paper. Thomas looked away. They carried nothing else from the basin. Not the kettle. Not the chair. Not the little cradle. They closed the wagon canvas and tightened the ropes before leaving. Nora tied the blue cup carefully beneath her coat. 3 weeks later, a county clerk in Elk Crossing copied the names from Samuel Grady's journal into the public record. 18 settlers were no longer listed as simply lost. 17 deaths were recorded along the southern drainage of Black Elk Ridge. The 18th name, Caleb Ward, was marked alive. Thomas Reed showed officials the burial cairns the following spring. Nora did not lead them to the wagons. She led them only as far as the graves. Some things needed witnesses. Others needed doors. Years later, hunters still passed below Black Elk Ridge without knowing what stood above them. 5 wagons remained in the hidden basin. The wheels sank another inch. Snow bent the old canvas. Grass grew tall around the axles every summer, and inside the second wagon, beneath a bench where Matthew Bell had once slept, one small empty space remained behind a wooden panel. The letter was gone. The promise was not. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a like for more forgotten frontier stories.